The breaking news alert on the radio made my blood run cold. It was 2:30 in the morning. We were driving through a dead zone on Interstate 40 just outside of Amarillo, Texas. The static on the radio cleared for a single, terrifying second. The announcer warned that a patient had escaped from the Panhandle psychiatric facility. He described the suspect as a female in her late 20s. He stated that she was extremely dangerous. Then, he mentioned her clothing. She was wearing a red rain jacket. I froze. I slowly looked down at my own chest. I was wearing a red rain jacket. However, the driver did not seem to notice. He was a large man with a thick neck and hands that gripped the steering wheel too tightly. He was staring straight ahead at the rain slashing against the windshield of his black Toyota Camry. But then, his eyes shifted. He looked into the rearview mirror. He looked directly at me. Suddenly, a loud mechanical sound echoed through the small cabin. Click. He had locked the doors. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps it was automatic. Perhaps it was a safety feature of the car. However, my instincts screamed otherwise. My instincts told me that he had heard the radio too. My instincts told me that he knew who I was. Or at least, he thought he knew who I was. I gripped the strap of my purse. Inside the main pocket, my fingers brushed against the cold steel of a jagged hunting knife. I had stolen it from the gas station 3 miles back. I squeezed the handle. I told myself to stay calm. I told myself not to attack unless he made the first move. But the atmosphere in the car was suffocating. It smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine air freshener. The driver cleared his throat. The sound was wet and guttural. He slowed the car down. We were dropping from 70 miles per hour to 40 and to the 40 and to this. Then to 20. He pulled the vehicle onto the gravel shoulder of the deserted highway. The tires crunched loudly against the loose rocks. He put the car in park. He turned around in his seat. His face was shadowed, but I could see his teeth. He smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just trapped a rabbit. He whispered that we needed to have a little talk. I stopped breathing. I realized with horror that I was trapped in a soundproof box in the middle of a desert storm. However, he did not know one critical fact. He thought I was a scared girl hitching a ride home. He did not know that the radio report was right. He did not know that I really was the monster from the news. And he did not know that I was not locked in here with him. He was locked in here with me. I loosened my grip on the knife handle hidden inside my purse. I forced a tremble into my lower lip. I needed him to believe I was weak. The man in the front seat leaned closer to the gap between the bucket seats. The orange light from the dashboard illuminated his face. It was greasy. Sweat beaded on his upper lip, despite the air conditioning blasting at full power. He stared at me with eyes that were too wide and too white. He did not speak immediately. He just breathed. His breath hissed in and out of his nose like a leaking tire. I pressed my back against the cold leather seat. I tried to calculate the distance between my hand and his jugular vein. It was less than 2 feet. However, I needed to wait. I needed to understand why he had stopped the car. 20 minutes ago. The ride had started normally. I had ordered the car from a burner phone I stole from a nurse at the facility. The app said my driver was named Gary. It stated that Gary drove a silver Honda Civic. But this car was a black Toyota. And this man was definitely not Gary. The profile picture showed a young college student with a bright smile. This man was in his 50s. His hands were rough and stained with dark grease under the fingernails. He wore a mechanic's jumpsuit with the name Earl stitched on the pocket. I had noticed the discrepancy immediately. However, I had been desperate. The sirens were wailing in the distance behind me. The psychiatric facility was in chaos. I had started a fire in the laundry room to cover my escape. I had climbed the fence while the orderlies were counting heads. So, when this car pulled up to the dark curb of the gas station, I got in. I did not care who was driving. I only cared that the car was moving away from the smoke. I wore the red rain jacket I had snatched from a clothesline in a backyard 2 miles away. It was 3 sizes too big. It smelled of wet dog and mildew, but it covered the white hospital gown that marked me as property of the state. I thought I was clever. I thought I was the only predator in the vehicle. But then, Earl began to ask questions. He had watched me through the rearview mirror for the first 10 miles. He had studied my face. He had noticed the mud on my bare ankles. He had seen the way I flinched every time a police cruiser passed us in the opposite lane. Now, the car was parked on the side of the desolate highway. Outside, the storm was intensifying. Rain lashed against the metal roof like handfuls of gravel. Thunder shook the chassis. Earl smiled again. He reached into his pocket. My muscles coiled. I prepared to strike. I prepared to drive the blade into his neck. But he did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a phone. He turned the screen toward me. It was the news alert. My face was on the screen. It was a mugshot from 3 years ago. My hair was shorter in the photo. My eyes were wild. The headline read, "Patient 42 escapes. Considered extremely dangerous." Earl tapped the screen with a thick finger. He chuckled. The sound was dry and devoid of humor. He accused me of being a celebrity. He stated that the reward for my capture was $50,000. I looked at the phone. Then I looked at him. I dropped the act. I stopped trembling. I wiped the fake tears from my eyes. I stared back at him with the cold, dead gaze that had terrified the doctors for 3 years. I asked him what he wanted. Earl licked his lips. He put the phone away. He reached under his seat. Metal scraped against metal. He pulled out a heavy tire iron. He slapped it into his open palm. Smack. He explained that he was not going to turn me in. He told me that $50,000 was a lot of money. However, he claimed that he had other uses for a girl who nobody would miss. He said that a runaway psycho was the perfect victim. Nobody would look for me. The police would assume I was still running. He leaned further back. He aimed the tire iron at my knee. He ordered me to put my hands on the headrest. He warned me not to scream. He told me that nobody could hear me out here in the void. I looked at the tire iron. Then I looked at the knife hidden in my purse. I realized the irony of the situation. He thought he had caught a helpless rabbit. He thought he was the wolf, but he had just locked himself in a cage with a tiger. I slowly raised my hands. He surrendered. Or at least, that is what I wanted him to think. I whispered a single question. I asked him if he believed in bad luck. Earl frowned. He did not understand. He demanded to know what I was talking about. I smiled. It was a sharp, jagged smile. I told him that picking me up was the worst luck of his life. Earl did not appreciate my humor. He roared with sudden, violent rage. The heavy tire iron swung through the narrow space of the cabin. I threw my head back against the doorframe. Whoosh. The cold steel bar missed my nose by a fraction of an inch. It smashed into the leather dashboard. Plastic splintered and flew into the air like shrapnel. He lunged across the center console. His weight pinned me against the passenger door. I tried to reach for my purse. I tried to grab the knife. However, Earl was faster. He backhanded me across the face. The impact was blinding. It felt like a block of concrete had struck my cheekbone. My head snapped back. I tasted copper and salt. Blood filled my mouth. I dropped the purse. It slid onto the floor mat beneath his feet. My weapon was gone. Earl grabbed a handful of my hair. He yanked my head forward until our noses were touching. His breath smelled of stale coffee and rot. He growled that I was going to regret opening my mouth. He slammed my head back against the window. Thud. My vision blurred. Black spots danced in front of my eyes. But I did not black out. I could not black out. Earl released me. He settled back into the driver's seat. He shifted the car into drive. The tires spun in the gravel. Rocks sprayed against the undercarriage. The car lurched back onto the highway. He stomped on the accelerator. The engine screamed. We accelerated rapidly. 40 miles per hour. 60 miles per hour. 80. The rain smeared the windshield into a blur of gray and black. Earl was driving like a maniac. He was taking me to his kill site. I pressed my hand against the window. The glass was cold. I looked down at the floor. My purse was wedged under his heavy work boot. I was unarmed. I was trapped in a metal box, moving at 80 miles per hour. And the man beside me was a predator who had done this before. I could feel it. I could feel the ritual in his movements. He reached for the radio dial. He turned up the volume. Classic rock blasted through the speakers. It drowned out the sound of the storm. It drowned out the sound of my ragged breathing. Earl began to tap his fingers on the steering wheel. He was enjoying this. He thought he had won. He thought he had silenced the girl in the red jacket. However, he had made a critical error. He assumed that I was afraid of death. But I was not afraid of death. I had lived with death for 3 years in the psychiatric ward. I had made friends with the darkness in my own mind. I started to laugh. It began as a low chuckle. Then it grew louder. It became a cackling, hysterical sound that cut through the music. Earl stopped tapping his fingers. He glanced at me. His brow furrowed in confusion. He demanded to know what was so funny. I turned to face him. I let the blood drip from my split lip onto my chin. I widened my eyes until they burned. I whispered that he was driving the wrong way. Earl frowned. He checked the GPS on his phone. He shouted that he knew where he was going. I shook my head slowly. I told him that I was not talking about the map. I explained that he was driving straight into hell. And I promised that I was the one driving the bus. Earl hesitated. His foot lifted slightly off the gas pedal. The car slowed to 70 miles per hour. Fear flickered in his eyes for the first time. He realized that I was not reacting like a normal victim. He realized that something was wrong. He reached for the tire iron again. He decided to finish me right there in the moving car. He raised the metal bar. But I was ready. I did not need the knife. I needed physics. I reached out with both hands. I did not grab him. I grabbed the steering wheel. I yanked it hard to the right. The laws of physics took over instantly. The tires caught the soft mud of the shoulder. The car did not just turn. It launched. The black Toyota hit the ditch at 70 miles per hour. Metal screamed against the earth. The front bumper dug into the soil like a shovel. The rear of the car flipped upward into the night sky. We rolled. Once. Twice. 3 times. The world became a violent centrifuge of glass, plastic, and darkness. My head slammed against the roof. My shoulder ground against the door pillar. Then, there was a deafening crunch. The car landed upside down. The roof collapsed inward. The engine hissed and died. Silence returned to the highway. The only sound was the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the undercarriage. I hung suspended in my seatbelt. Blood rushed to my head. My vision swam in and out of focus. I tasted gasoline. I wiggled my toes. They moved. Ich flexed me fingers. They worked. I was alive. I looked over at the driver's seat. Earl was not so lucky. The roof had caved in on his side. He was pinned between the steering wheel and the crushed ceiling. His left arm was twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood poured from a deep gash on his forehead. He was unconscious. I reached for the buckle of my seatbelt. Click. I dropped onto the ceiling of the car, which was now the floor. Broken glass bit into my palms. I ignored the pain. I crawled toward the shattered passenger window. I pulled myself out into the storm. The rain felt like ice against my burning skin. I stood up in the mud. I took a deep breath of the cold, wet air. I looked down at the wreckage. The car was a crumpled ball of metal. Suddenly, a groan came from inside. Earl was waking up. I walked around to the driver's side. I crouched down next to the broken window. I peered inside. Earl opened his eyes. He saw me. He saw the red rain jacket standing in the darkness. Confusion washed over his bloody face. Then, the memory returned. Fear replaced the confusion. He tried to move. He screamed. The sound was wet and ragged. He realized he was trapped. He looked at me with pleading eyes. He begged me to help him. He whispered that he could not feel his legs. He promised that he would not hurt me if I got him out. I smiled. I reached into the pocket of my oversized jacket. I pulled out the jagged hunting knife. It had fallen out of my purse during the crash, but I had recovered it from the mud. Earl's eyes widened. He stopped begging. He started to cry. I leaned closer to the window. I spoke softly over the sound of the rain. I told him that he had misunderstood the situation. I explained that I did not crash the car to escape him. I crashed the car because I needed a new vehicle. Earl frowned. He did not understand. His car was destroyed. However, I pointed toward the horizon. Blue and red lights were flashing in the distance. Sirens wailed against the wind. A police cruiser was approaching the scene of the accident. I looked back at Earl. I thanked him for the ride. I told him that he was a very useful distraction. Earl tried to shout. He tried to warn the approaching officers. But I did not let him. I raised the knife. I did not hesitate. I drove the blade into his throat. Slash. The sound was lost in the thunder. Earl gurgled once. Then he went still. His eyes stared blankly at the upside-down dashboard. I wiped the blade on his mechanic's jumpsuit. I dropped the knife into the tall grass beside the ditch. I stood up. The police car slowed down. It pulled onto the shoulder. The headlights blinded me. I put my hands up. I collapsed to my knees in the mud. I started to sob. He screamed for help. I played the part of the terrified victim perfectly. A young officer stepped out of the cruiser. He had a flashlight in one hand and a gun in the other. He saw a crying girl in a red jacket next to a brutal car wreck. He saw a dead man in the driver's seat. He lowered his weapon. He ran toward me. He asked if I was okay. He asked if I was hurt. I looked up at him through my tears. I lied. I told him that the man had kidnapped me. I told him that I caused the crash to save my own life. The officer nodded. He looked at Earl's body. He saw the throat wound. He assumed it was from the crash debris. He assumed I was lucky to be alive. He holstered his gun. He reached out a hand to help me up. He told me that I was safe now. He led me toward the warmth of his patrol car. He opened the back door. He told me to sit inside and warm up while he called for an ambulance. I climbed into the back seat of the police cruiser. I sat on the hard plastic seat. I watched the officer walk back toward the wreckage to check for a pulse. I looked at the mesh partition between the front and back seats. It was locked. However, the officer had made a mistake. In his rush to help a victim, he had left the engine running, and he had left the keys in the ignition. I looked at the officer's back. He was distracted. He was calling dispatch. I looked at the small sliding window in the partition. It was unlatched. I smiled. I was not safe. And neither was he. I stared at the back of the officer's head through the rain-streaked windshield. He was 20 feet away. He was kneeling in the mud beside the crushed Toyota. He was checking Earl for a pulse that I knew he would not find. This was my window. This was the single second that would define my survival. I reached through the open partition window. I ignored the pain in my bruised ribs. I grabbed the heavy tactical vest hanging on the passenger seat. I pulled myself forward. My hips scraped against the plastic divider. I kicked my legs. I tumbled headfirst into the front cabin of the police cruiser. My shoulder hit the center console. I scrambled upright. I sat in the driver's seat. The leather was warm. The engine purred with the power of a V8 Interceptor. It felt like a rocket ship compared to Earl's dying sedan. However, the movement caught the officer's attention. He stood up abruptly. He spun around. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness and hit my face. He saw the girl in the red jacket sitting behind his steering wheel. His expression shifted from concern to pure horror. He realized his mistake. He realized he had left the keys in the ignition. He dropped his flashlight. He reached for his service pistol. He shouted for me to freeze. But I did not freeze. I slammed my hand onto the door lock button. Click. I grabbed the gear shift. I threw the car into drive. I stomped on the gas pedal. The rear tires spun against the wet asphalt. Smoke and steam rose from the wheel wells. The heavy car fishtailed violently. Then, the tires found traction. The cruiser launched forward like a bullet leaving a chamber. Bang. The rear windshield exploded. Glass showered onto the back seat. The officer had fired his weapon. But his aim was poor in the storm. I watched him in the rearview mirror. He was shrinking rapidly. He was a small, dark figure standing alone in the middle of a desert storm. He was stranded next to a corpse with no radio and no vehicle. I smiled. I turned on the wipers. I adjusted the rearview mirror to see my own reflection. The red jacket was stained with mud, and Earl's blood. However, the car was pristine. I looked at the dashboard computer. It was a glowing map of the entire county. It showed the location of every patrol unit in the area. I saw blue dots moving on the screen. They were all heading toward the psychiatric facility 20 miles east. They were looking for a fugitive on foot. They were looking for a scared girl running through the fields. They were not looking for a police officer driving west toward the city. Suddenly, the radio crackled. A female voice spoke from dispatch. She requested a status update from Unit 4 Alpha. She asked if the accident scene was secure. My heart rate did not increase. I felt calm. I felt powerful. I picked up the handset. I pressed the transmit button. I lowered my voice an octave. I added a rough, tired texture to my tone. I mimicked the officer who was currently standing in the rain. I reported that the scene was clear. I stated that the victim was dead on arrival. I lied that the suspect had fled into the canyon to the north. I advised all units to set up a perimeter 5 miles away from my location. There was a pause. Static hissed through the speaker. I held my breath. Then, the dispatcher replied. She copied the message. She redirected the approaching units to the North Canyon. She cleared my path. I hung up the microphone. I laughed. It was a soft, delighted sound. I had just turned the entire police force into my personal security detail. I looked down at the passenger seat. There was a duffel bag. I unzipped it with one hand while I steered with the other. Inside, I found a spare uniform shirt. I found a hat. I found a box of ammunition. I stripped off the dirty red rain jacket. I threw it out the window. The wind caught the red fabric. It fluttered away into the night like a dying bird. I put on the police cap. I buttoned the oversized shirt. I looked in the mirror again. The monster was gone. The fugitive was gone. In her place sat a dedicated public servant. I checked the GPS. I was 10 miles from the city limits of Amarillo. I had $50,000 on my head. But I also had a full tank of gas and a police radio. I turned on the sirens. Wee-woo, wee-woo. The blue and red lights cut through the darkness. Traffic ahead of me pulled over to the side of the road. Cars yielded to my authority. They thought I was coming to save them. They did not know I was coming to feed. I whispered to the empty car. I announced that the shift was just starting. I rolled down the window as I entered the city limits of Amarillo. The storm was breaking. The heavy rain had turned into a light, freezing drizzle. I breathed in the smell of wet pavement and exhaust fumes. It smelled like freedom. I patrolled the streets for an hour. I watched the citizens of this sleeping city. They were everywhere. I saw a man walking his dog. I saw a couple arguing on a street corner. I saw a teenager waiting for a bus. They all looked at my car with the same expression. Respect. Caution. Safety. They saw the black and white paint. They saw the light bar. They saw the shield on the door. Therefore, they assumed that the person inside was a hero. They assumed that I was there to protect them from the darkness. I found this hilarious. Because I was the darkness. I was the thing that they locked their doors to keep out. But now, I had the keys to the city. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. I turned off the engine. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror one last time. The police cap cast a shadow over my eyes. The uniform shirt hid the bruises on my neck. I looked trustworthy. I looked authoritative. I looked sane. And that is the terrifying truth about monsters. We do not look like monsters. We do not have fangs or claws or glowing red eyes. We look like your neighbor. We look like your teacher. We look like the police officer who pulls you over on a lonely highway. I reached for the radio handset. I called dispatch one last time. I told them that I was ending my shift. I told them that the streets were safe. The dispatcher wished me a good night. I smiled. I opened the car door and stepped out into the cool night air. I walked toward the diner. Inside, there were people eating late-night pie. There were families. There were truck drivers. I walked in. A bell chimed above the door. Heads turned. They saw the uniform. They smiled at me. A waitress waved me over to an empty booth. She offered me a free coffee. She thanked me for my service. I thanked her back. I sat down. I took a sip of the hot, black liquid. I realized that I would never have to run again. I did not need to hide in the shadows. I just needed to wear the right costume. So, the next time you are driving alone at night, the next time you see headlights in your rearview mirror, the next time you see a uniform approaching your window, do not assume you are safe. Do not assume that the person behind the badge is a savior. Check the eyes. Look for the hunger. Because the wolf does not always wear a red jacket. Sometimes, the wolf wears a badge. My name is Patient 42, and I am officially off duty. Class is dismissed.